Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update news segment. I'm going to try and rattle through some news because it's a busy day for me. I might have to split this into several parts. It depends how quickly I can go. Let's go to our opening gambit. The Russian losses, as according to the Ukrainian figures that they release on a daily basis, usual caveats, inaccurate propaganda. Russia don't produce the same results. I have to say this. YouTube have stung me once for supposed misinformation, but they haven't told me why. And yeah, whatever. Anyway, this is what the Ukrainians say. Take it with a pinch of salt, but I think it is indicative and useful and does have some degree of accuracy. 1,090 liquidated personnel. There have been, that's a huge number, right? This is, the numbers have ticked right back up to record numbers on a daily basis the last couple of days for the Russian losses. There are strikes that are taking place behind the lines with HIMARS and possibly Vilka M. Again, I think Mariupol has been hit. The airport around there has been hit yesterday. And they're also apparently really high figures around Bakhmut, which is why the Ukrainians are still defending Bakhmut, because of the attritional value it has, at least according to the Ukrainians. And that's not to say Ukrainians don't also suffer, significant casualties as well in terms of both troops and equipment. Well, 8 tanks, 7 APCs, so that's a fairly useful number of those. 4 artillery systems, 2 anti-aircraft systems. That's generally a pretty useful statistic to have. They need to, over time, take out the anti-aircraft capabilities of the Russians. So you want, if you're pro-Ukrainian, you will want some figures there on a daily basis. 2 might not sound a lot compared to tanks, but there are a lot more sort of T-62s and T-72s and whatever tanks hanging around, far fewer S-300 systems. It depends what these anti-aircraft systems are, whether they are like some autocannons or whether these are, books, or as I say, S300s, S400s, these kind of things. So anyway, useful to have those on the list. Vehicles and fuel tanks, 4. So certainly for liquidated personnel, high numbers for the Russians there. To feed into that, over the past day near Bakhmut, says Serhiy Cheravati, the Russian army has lost 535 soldiers killed and wounded. So that's both, but there's 535 taken out. Now it depends whether liquidated, and there's this ongoing discussion. Some people claim that is definitely dead soldiers. Some others claim, like the BBC, claim that this is not. This actually represents dead and wounded, just taken out there. It depends on the translation of liquidated and how and whether that is indeed the right word that they've used. This conversation hasn't been put to bed yet, but anyway, 535 is going to feed into that daily number. 535 Russians in Bakhmut alone. The spokesman for the Eastern Group of Forces says on air. Now, if those two figures are in the same, from the same type of data or from the same data set, then that tells you that Bakhmut is responsible for half the losses on the entire front line. So for this entire front line, from Kupiansk down to, Kimbern Spit here, half of the figures are lost in one tiny place alone. If that is the case. So Russia, says John Spencer, and of course, this is, looking from a Ukrainian point of view, Russia will run out of soldiers. I don't care what people say about the amount that they can force into service. They tried to mobilize 300,000, required capturing people off the street, and more than 400,000 Russian men fled the country. And this is referring to an infographic here of the average soldiers losses of soldiers per day. Now, I would call into question how these figures are compiled and whether they are like-for-like comparisons, but anyway, just as a rule of thumb, as a kind of like rough ballpark. So Russia is now probably losing more soldiers per day than North Korea and Vietnam combined in the Korean and Vietnam wars. However, record losses do not seem to stop Russia from continuing to its offensive. Where the guy that I was talking from, or quoting from, says that actually it will. You just can't. It is not sustainable. They won't be able to keep continuing with these losses. Russia's losses for the last month of the war from 795, and again, it depends what losses mean, how they've compiled those figures. Those are obviously very different from the figures we've just seen here, which are those are the losses, per day. So again, just take this as a generalization that Russia is losing a lot of people a day and a month, and historically speaking, that puts it up near one of the highest losses in the wars in modern history. 122 tanks lost, says Trent Telenko, looking at Ragnar Gudmundsson. Now, he takes his figures from the Ukrainian General Staff. So if you don't agree with these figures, then you won't agree with this analysis. However, let's just go with it anyway. 122 tanks lost is more than dozens of nations, including some in NATO, have in their entire military. And this is interesting to get this into perspective. Like, the sheer numbers here are staggering. There are countries that don't have this many tanks even remotely, and yet Russia are losing them in a in a month or whatever. So 122 tanks were added to the records of Oryx in February, of which 57 were captured or abandoned. 54% were made in the Soviet era, while the rest were either made or modified after 1991, up from the previous month. So actually, there's been this idea that Russia are losing fewer tanks as the war goes on because they have fewer tanks and they're not on the front lines as much because they just don't have as many. And so you will see them losing fewer and fewer tanks. However, last month, more tanks, says Ragnar Gudmundsson. So not a good month for tank losses for the Russians, and you can look to Vuhledar and you can look to Avdiivka and the losses around there particularly. Also, there's some losses around Kreminna too. So it is a bad month for that kind of equipment loss. Right, the British MOD, or the British UK intelligence update, talks again about losses in terms of death rates. Sorry, let's read through it here. As Russia continues to suffer extremely heavy casualties, the impact varies dramatically across Russia's regions. So I was talking, my point about Bakhmut there is entirely in line with this. In proportion to the size of their population, the richest cities. Oh, sorry, it's a slightly different point. This is about the area of USSR. The area of Russia. The whole of Russia as a geographic place, and within that, all the different regions. And it turns out the richest areas are losing the fewest number of Russian troops. So the richest cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg have been left relatively unscathed. This is especially true for the families of the country's elite. And indeed, you saw the first couple of rows in Putin's speech, and none of those people had a son who had been mobilized. Of the people, all these important dignitaries who are in the front rows of Putin's famous speech recently. Yeah. So on the 21st of February 2023, Russian senior officials were photographed making up the front two. Oh my goodness, I haven't read this fully yet, and this is what it says. Oh my goodness, front two rows of, I'd only read that first paragraph, of the audience of President Putin's State of the Nation speech. None of those are known to have children serving in the military. I swear, UK intelligence is just like hanging out on Twitter half the time, maybe 3/4 of the time. In many of the eastern regions, deaths are likely running as a percentage of population at a rate of 30 to 40 times higher than in Moscow. In many places, ethnic minorities take the biggest hit. In Astrakhan, some 75% of casualties from the minority Kazakh and Tatar populations. As the Russian MOD seeks to address its continued deficit of combat personnel, insulating the better off and more influential elements of Russian society will highly likely remain a major consideration. Remember, highly likely is in the UK 75% to 95%, so really is high probability of that. And what the BBC actually have been doing work with Medusa, an independent Russian media outlet, to compile known deaths, like Oryx does for equipment. BBC Russia have been doing this by scouring the internet and information sources to find out funerals and death announcements of people, and so they've actually got quite a fairly good sense of where people are dying in Russia. Okay, let's go and look at certain things getting blown up just to try and get a picture of losses. So in the city of Donetsk, 2 Russian Grodzika 122 milled self-propelled howitzers, so guns on tracks, were targeted by what appears to be Gimlers fired from a HIMARS. As a result, at least one SPH was put out of action. The reason I've included this is quite a rarity. If this is true, and I can't tell you whether that is a HIMARS hit, but someone with more knowledge than me, Ukraine Weapons Track has a great deal of knowledge on this, seems to think that's a HIMARS hit, and that is quite rare. And then I don't know whether that's another hit there, but this was cooking off from shrapnel by the looks of it, hitting that from the HIMARS hit. So anyway, point is, using HIMARS to hit things like this is interesting because they've previously only been used to take out high value targets like ammunition depots, supply depots, troop accumulations. Taking out pieces of equipment is individual or in pairs is quite a rarity, and I don't know what that says, whether they've run out of targets to hit or whether these just have that high value now. The special Kraken unit has destroyed 2 observation towers in Bryansk and Kursk regions. So these are in Russia. Now, these observation towers, it's interesting that they've done this because of what they're using. It looks like they're using ATGMs to take these things out, which I find quite interesting. So these towers must be really close to the border, because I doubt this is an incursion into Russia, but they are indeed firing these from some kind of, I couldn't quite work out what that was, and taking out these observation towers. So 2 of them have been taken out in Russian regions, another one there, and I think that might have been the one I showed you before. But that the argument is that that's not a drone. Before I thought, yeah, I don't know, maybe so this may actually be a 2nd and 3rd observation tower being taken out, but these with ATGMs are not with the drone. The previous one I showed was with the drone. I'm showing you this because I don't know whether this is a hit with something like JDAM, but that's a considerable hit that doesn't look like something like a piece of artillery. And I don't know why they'd be attacking a place like that. There are people there. People, that's hitting their people. So this might be some kind of bunker system, trench. I don't know, some accumulation which is worthy of hitting with a JDAM. I don't know, but anyway, I've included that because it just looks like a JDAM, but it might not be. I'm sure you guys know more than me there. And we are starting to see a lot more drone footage that is relevant to see from the Ukrainians. Now, I don't know if this is the same with the Russians, but you're starting to see more thermal drone activity. And there's been a lot of fundraising for thermal drones. Thermal drones are particularly useful because obviously they can see people much more clearly at night, because the contrast shows them very clearly, and they're taking people out. I won't show you this because it shows you people getting blown up quite explicitly, but just to say that thermal drone imagery is happening quite a lot more, and a lot more first-person view kamikaze drones that are being used by the Ukrainians. So this is one of 2 I've seen of tanks. One was actually in a built-up area. I don't know where it was, and it looked like it wasn't a rubble area. So I'm kind of interested where that hit. But you're starting to see moving vehicles like tanks get hit with FPV drones, and this is again a bit of a change in tactics, but a change in capability. Moving on here, we got a Russian depot being blown up near Svatova. We haven't. Oh, do shut up. We haven't seen a lot of this recently, kind of HIMARS-ish. I presume it's a HIMARS strike. It's Svatova. This is talking about high value rather than like an individual SPG. This is like all the ammunition for a whole bunch of SPGs to be used over like a month or something like that. So this is what I mean by high value targets for HIMARS. But it could be that they're running out of them, and that's why they're hitting individual pieces of equipment. I don't know. And then we've got Mariupol being hit. And this is not to say Russia will be hitting a bunch of places as well, of course. And I am only showing you Ukrainian stuff, so you've got to bear that in mind. But this is significant because it's Mariupol, which is out of HIMARS range generally. So this is almost certainly going to be something like a Vilka M. Almost certainly not going to be HIMARS, is my point. And that is going to be, you would think, a high value target if it is indeed the Cotton over Mariupol airport. So that's the airport. So that will cause the Russians quite a headache. Now, on the other hand, Russians are hitting Zaporizhia, and apparently they hit Zaporizhia with S-300s that were sort of brought up from Berdyansk district, and in fact they've been followed. 40 minutes. Is quite a big. Work out what you're talking about, Pierce. This is quite a big journey for them to go and hit Zaporizhia. I think it's the idea. They've kind of tracked where these S-300s came from Berdyansk to then hit Zaporizhia in the ground capability. So that is Zaporizhia being under quite a lot of. It has been for months, actually. S-300s is one of the favoured, I said that the other day, one of the favoured targets for S-300s. But it does mean that quite a lot of civilian architecture and civilian buildings could get taken out by that. Okay, Russia on fire. Moscow, the office of the propaganda TV channel Spars has caught fire, and lots of fire engines, as you can see there. So quite a big issue. I can't see any evidence of the fire there particularly, unless that's the smoke down there, but I don't know where it is. But anyway, fire at a propaganda TV channel. could well be sort of partisan activity in some way. Okay, let's go on to military aid. So I didn't really badmouth the F-18, but I said it was 40 years old. But of course, these things get upgraded, and they are pretty decent planes, the F-18s, and they can apparently, because they are generally, I think they were designed for aircraft carrier use, so they're quite good at taking off from short runways. So that would be useful for Ukraine. I don't know whether their engines will suck in a lot of FOD sort of debris on the runway, which is one of the problems with using. That's why the Gripen is favoured by some people like Justin Bronk, who's a aircraft expert in war. But anyway, if Finland were touted with possibly, like, the idea has been touted that they could give Ukraine F-18 Hornets and give them training. However, commenting on Finland's Prime Minister's idea to send F-18 Hornet aircraft to Ukraine, Finnish Air Force Commander Major General Karanen says Finland cannot afford to give up its Hornet fleet until the replacement F-35As are operational. So I don't know what that says. Like, going forward, it looks like that's not going to happen anytime soon. So don't get your hopes up. And I'm sorry for loads of people piled on to me about F-15 Hornets are great. Don't, shut up. You know what you're talking about. Okay, sorry. Denmark's acting defense minister hopes Ukraine will receive the first Leopard 1A5 tanks in the spring. So these are Leopard 1s. They have to get people out of retirement to train people up on these because they're not used. They haven't been used for some time. So the expertise is kind of gone. But, that's... We'll receive the first Leopard 1A5s in the spring. Well, we're in the spring now, so that's really interesting. In total, Denmark plans to donate at least 100 Leopard 1s to Ukraine in collaboration with Germany and the Netherlands. That's huge news. Luxembourg, 14 armoured ambulances given, so fantastic, all helpful. US offers 300 M2A2. These are infantry fighting vehicles for Greece to replace the M113 and BMP-1 calculated. US calculated the amount needed to restore the equipment is around 300 million euros for 300 machines. From this amount, the cost of the equipment that Greece has transferred to Ukraine will probably be deducted, said Greece media. So all this kind of backfilling is all very useful for getting some of the old equipment to Ukraine that they know how to use, some of the Soviet era equipment that Greece has and is willing to give. But again, you've almost got to thank America more than Greece, right? Ukrainian soldiers conducting training on US Army Bradley IFVs somewhere in Eastern Europe. So just to talk about the Bradleys, these are going to be so important for combined arms initiatives, offensives, the counteroffensive for Ukraine in the coming months. Kyiv privately seeks US cluster bombs to be dropped from drones, according to Reuters. US lawmakers Jason Crow and Adam Smith say Ukraine sees them as a way to stop the human wave tactics that Russia has been actively using in recent months, most notably in Bakhmut. However, advisor to Zaluzhny, Dan Rice, says Turkish-supplied DPICM cluster bombs were one of the biggest game changers of the war. Using highly explosive Ukrainian artillery against Russian infantry is like throwing darts at ants. With DPICM, it's like using a flamethrower against a whole anthill. So after Turkey started supplying DPICM, so I didn't know about this, to Ukraine, Russian daily casualties have increased exponentially from 100 to 200 to 600 to 800 soldiers killed daily, Rice has claimed. So when you start looking back at those figures of the daily figures up to 1,090 or whatever it is today and yesterday, how much is down to cluster munitions? People have been talking about cluster munitions need to be sent to Ukraine. Ukraine have asked for them. They're not illegal, as US aren't signed up to not using them, but some people don't like them because you get them and they're left and they don't explode, and then people walk over them in civilian times after wars are over, and it's all a bit of trouble. But now is what they need. In war, it's what they need, and you worry about that afterwards. And you, like with the mines, you clean them up. You have a really big operation to clean them up. So there's a really solid argument that, goodness me, if you can use it like S300s to blow up this, or if you're going to use, I don't know, HIMARS, then what's the difference between HIMARS and a cluster munition? Like, nothing really. It's just different ways of dying. And you can argue this with, like, even with, there is an argument to say things like chemical weapons. There is a false category to say those are horrible. It's like getting your arm and face half blown off but still alive by an RPG, right? Compared to getting your upper body melted by chemical weapons. Is there really a significant difference to the horror of them? No, not really. So there is possibly a false distinction. Anyway, I don't want to get into that argument, but cluster munitions are one thing that Ukraine have been asking for, and there's good reason that they should be given them for warfare. Anyway, I mean, you're going to give them all these other types of weapons. Why not these? Russian T-62 MVs undergoing modernization and upgrades to more modern systems such as thermal imaging at the 103rd Armored Repair Plant city of Chita in southeastern Russia. This is a long way away from, this is right near Mongolia. The Russian military is planning to modernize at least 800 T-62 tanks at this plant. So this is huge. But the thing is, this is apparently over 3 years, right? So it's huge, but will it happen? How much capability is there for them to get this done quickly? Anyway, this is significant because those are important ways of doing up tanks. Danilov has said Russia is burning through decades of weapon supplies. National Security and Defense Council Secretary Alexei Danilov said on March 11th that Russia expected to fight a quick blitzkrieg operation after launching a full-scale invasion on February. The official added that Russia's corrupt economy was incapable of supplying its frontline needs and now needs external assistance as a matter of primary importance. So this is another claim that they are burning up their artillery. Okay, if you want to check out, so I don't have time to do it now, Syriac Maps has loads of analyses today on the different front lines, lots of actual text rather than just maps. So well worth looking if you want to get an understanding of that. Philip O'Brien says the clearest articulation at the moment of the Ukrainian government's case for continuing to fight in Bakhmut is summed up by Podolyak in an interview with Zelensky's aide with an Italian newspaper. Ukraine has two main goals. This is nothing we don't know. I've been saying this for weeks. Motivating the Bakhmut campaign to allow time to prepare for its counteroffensive later. They want time to well prepare their forces and to continue to wear down Russian forces, which they know Russia is committing. And Podolyak takes aim at a few of the widespread assumptions out there. First, the Russians are not just throwing convicts at Bakhmut. They are increasingly concentrating their trained military personnel there along with good PMC fighters. If you read the whole excerpt, you'll see more. The Ukrainians repeating the claim that Russians are losing between 7 to 5 soldiers for each Ukrainian in Bakhmut. If this is true, then and NATO intelligence supports it, this is a massive slaughter of the Russians. And so this is obviously another reason that they're doing that. So those talking about ending the Battle of Bakhmut don't provide nearly the strategically well thought out case that the Ukrainians have put forward, in my humble opinion. So Philip O'Brien is justifying continuing to support to defend Bakhmut. And Russians in Luhansk make civilians suffer more and more. Hospitals are turned into barracks. So again, it protects those soldiers from being attacked by HIMARS and whatnot. And only used to treat the wounded soldiers. Civilians have almost no access to medicines. And this is coming from Luhansk military admin. This is Serhiy Haidai, so saying that. So pretty controversial, but problematic if you've got medical treatment needing to be sorted in Luhansk. And here is what the spring thaws to the snow does. Look at that. That's a Ukrainian trench. Pretty terrible conditions for those wanting to fight in trenches at the moment and going forward for the next couple of months. Anyway, that was me doing the biggest rush through the news. I'm really sorry that was so super rushed. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all your support. And I will try and get a frontline update to you maybe later, but I might not be able to today. And again, apologies, it was rushed. Take care. Speak soon.